Dearly beloved, it's another one of those special episodes of Making Magic podcast where I get to introduce you to somebody really cool that I have met on the internet or out in the world. Uh, this guest today, Lydia Lee. Uh, I've never met in person, but we've hung out on the Zoom room a couple times and we really hit it off. And I feel like what we're going to bring to this conversation is something that all of you probably internally feel like you want, but perhaps you're taking actions that are out of alignment with what Lydia specializes in. So, who is Lydia Lee? Lydia Lee is a work reinvention strategist. I don't think any of you have ever heard that word before. So, she's the founder of Screw the Cubicle, where she's leading the tiny business revolution, challenging the bigger is better narrative in business. She helps accomplished professionals build sustainable, profitable businesses that give them freedom instead of taking it away. And so, my intentions for this conversation, everybody, is to really just open you up to new ways of thinking about the ways you're going about growing your business, generating revenue, income. So many of us, and we are talking just before I press the record button, are trying to model people like Anthony Robbins. And we just want to say you don't have to be Anthony Robbins because he's doing that. And maybe you could do something that's different, that's more aligned with you and the lifestyle that you want. So, without further ado, Lydia, how you doing? Nice to see you. Good morning. You're in
Bradley.
Bali right now. We're gonna
Yes,
watch a sunrise behind you. It's so exciting.
I know you are going to see the sunrise behind me and maybe a few roosters in the morning because they are loud and proud.
All right, I'm ready for it. Let's do it. I really appreciate you waking up so early to come do this conversation.
Of
So
course.
let's just talk about this tiny business revolution. I love that. I mean, to me, when we did a signature workshop for my workshop for your people. The conversations we've had. I mean, I live on a small island. It's a village-minded lifestyle that I'm taking as an approach. Having more fun is the ultimate goal for me. And so I really resonate with your messaging and what you're trying to do with the people that you're working with. And so I'm just curious, like, how do you run your business? What is the minimalist approach that you take when growing your business and generating revenue?
Mm. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I wasn't always a tiny business advocate, because I've been in business for 12 years and you learn a lot over a decade for sure. And obviously, as you just mentioned, I'm in Bali. I'm someone that sort of prioritizes a lot of travel and, I'm someone that needs kind of different environments to feel creative, just like learning new languages, having different food, talking to different people. That kind of sparks like the kind of butterflies in my stomach, for just that zest for life that I need to have, a bit of those like changing types of conversations and culture and all those things to kind of fuel me as a human, right? So as you can imagine, that takes a lot of organization, right? To be in different time zones. I'm waking up right 5 in the morning for you today. There's always a price of admission. I always say for every choice, but those choices are very important to me, right? I just had, my best friend from Canada visit last week in kind of a last minute trip. It was important for me to take off a week really quickly to be able to host them, right? So having like systems in place to allow my business to run without me, right, in the most simplest way possible is what I've been working towards to ensure that I don't have all these like different moving parts constantly, right, that are 365 days a year, right? I don't do launches, for example, right? Thank God. I used to hate these sort of ticking deadlines of signing up for certain things of like, a big launch where my audience gets bombarded with emails and I'm exhausted at the end of the launch to even teach at the new
Yeah.
cohort. I've moved into more of an evergreen model, for example, that's more kind of like is available all throughout the year, but I do different things to kind of market and kind of bring more life back to the projects that I am offering,
Yeah.
and keeping things really minimal. Like I don't really do any complicated like funnels or ways to get to me. I'm kind of like grassroots. I love filming like quick Loom videos. I use an app called, Warm Welcome, which is kind of like Bonjoro, where I send quick little voicemails while I'm on the go. I'll be at the airport sometimes and, sending a voicemail or a video to a potential client. And I think people actually really like that, knowing like that's a bit about my life. They can see it in action in a way that I'm not always behind a desk. I'm not
Yeah.
always just, having to be in front of my computer to do certain things. But that requires me to kind of have intentional choices of how I market, right? Which, as you know, as a coach and an online business, sometimes marketing becomes the thing you do,
Yeah.
and I remember thinking to myself years ago when I used to launch, 4, 5 times a year and have multiple offers to, think about every year. I remember it's like saying to a colleague of mine, I'm like, I got into this business to be a coach, and here I am being a marketer. Like I'm having
Yeah.
to be an online marketer, an influencer, like all the things I don't like doing. And what I want to do is just to coach,
Yeah.
So that really kind of just helped me go, well, what does marketing mean to me? You know, it's meaningful conversations. It's not
Yeah.
funnels. It's not keywords. It's not, I don't post that much on social media. They're relationships that I want to nurture, so like you and I are talking because we had a conversation to get to know
Yeah.
each other and found an alignment in how we can support each other's businesses. And then I get to do this fun thing where I just talk to you and share my story. And that's kind of how I like to market is, things like podcasts, workshops, as you're a big advocate for. And I have one YouTube channel that I just create really good videos on. And I do that consistently for the last decade. And that's my number one way of bringing people into my world. And I write a newsletter every single week. That's about it. And
Beautiful.
that
You
is
got your
enough,
rhythm, you've got your routine, you've got your offers dialed, and it's just you've got that working. I mean,
Yeah,
that is the conversation that I'm having all the time is like marketing is conversations, relationships are your best friend in business. Stop using the megaphone and start connecting with individuals again. Like that is
absolutely.
it's so simple. And I feel like the social media world of online marketing has taken us so far away from the basics when the basics do work.
Totally. And you mentioned before about like not everyone wants to be the next Tony Robbins. Not everybody wants to be the next whatever gurus out there that you see building an empire because sometimes you don't see what's behind the scenes of what's going on, right? To be that much on social media, whatever it is that they're doing to get that big, they have a team behind them. There's money involved. There's ad money, right? People don't talk about how much money they spend on ads to bring in the leads, right? And so we have to kind of question like, is that how I want to see myself working in my business? Do I want to have a bigger team and be able to afford that and put a lot of my revenue towards right having staff and salaries to pay for, or is it something what do I really want in my business? And sometimes people maybe have only seen examples, because the people that are the gurus, that are the famous, kind of bigger than thou kind of brands are the ones that you see the most because they have the most social media presence.
Yeah.
You don't hear about I know I love some of the people that I'm friends with that are, you never heard of them, but they're very successful. They do things very privately. They're, in different ways of how they market. That's not always in this sort of like front and center. Social media has become a whole part of our world. So whoever we see on there are who we think are the only people having
Yeah.
successful businesses. So, I wish there was more ways for people to find out, right, about an alternative, business model, alternative reality where someone can
Yeah.
be very successful and not be everywhere online in order to do so, right? So I always look at it like, someone like Tony Robbins, he's trying to fill an arena, right, of people. That's a whole other way to market, right? You need to be to the masses, right? Very big marketing style. For me, it's like, how do we want to fill a living room? What's a
Yeah.
cozy way? Like, how do you invite people to a living room? It's very different than inviting people to an arena, right? It's more
Yeah.
intimate. It's a lot more curated. It's a lot more, right? Relationship style building, right? Where you really care about these long term. Because that living room, if you got a bad seat in there, a bad, like someone that doesn't fit, you can tell, right? Like
Yeah.
that
You
person
feel it in the
doesn't
room.
belong here. Fill in
Yeah.
the room, right? So that sort of careful curation is so important, right, for a tiny business. But how we invite even people to work with us becomes very different than trying to invite the masses, to come into your world.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. And so I would imagine you went through, was there like a moment in your life where things were getting out of hand and there was like a turning point for you where a switch just flicked inside of you and you were like, oh, I need to redefine what success is for me?
Yeah, I wish I could say that I just had an epiphany and did
Yeah.
things right. But I am kind of a hard ass for pain, like I was someone that's very motivated by pain. So,
Yeah.
when it sort of happened around sort of like I was in business for about 3 to 4 years at that time and doing a really, first 2, 3 years is like a doozy, right? You're like just trying to hold on for dear life, trying to make something work. And, I lived abroad as well. It was a lot of sort of, organizing to have a location independent business. And I think
Yeah.
I did really well in that sort of highest, 2015, 2016. I felt like I reached this like, whoa, everything I've been working for, the revenue made sense. Like I was, at that year, I was also featured on like huge publications on Forbes and Huffington Post and Virgin magazine. Like all the things were happening for me, and it's like
Yeah.
that moment to be really proud of my accomplishments. But that was also the year, the end of that year, after my final launch of like, I think it was the eighth product I launched that year, including online programs, coaching programs, retreats, speaker arrangements, like all the things, right, that you're supposed to
Yeah.
have in your repertoire as a coach. And I just had the worst burnout, like worse than the burnout I had in corporate, which already was a bad one. I literally developed agoraphobia in a hotel room on a business trip. So that was bad in 2012. And then I had a second one in my own business, except I was the boss and had no one else to blame but myself.
Yeah.
So it kind of like that moment, I think it was again a necessary kind of like pattern interrupt, to my reality of like, whoa, like even though I am someone that is such a type A perfectionist, I really learned that from my immigrant parents that, gave me that narrative of like, you work your ass off to get to something when we move over to Canada,
Mm.
and that stayed with me, right, for such a long time of like doing everything that was painful in order to receive success, to think I was worthy of that money or respect or whatever it was. It was, that internal narrative. And so even though my brain was like, we can do it, let's keep going, my body, as usual, were like, nope, we got to do something to wake you up, which debilitated me again, right? And I had to take about 3 months off the business, which was
Wow.
scary. But that
Yeah.
actually, again, I needed to take some distance away from it to reevaluate. Again, that same story I asked myself in corporate. What, like, you climb that ladder, you've climbed that mountain, and then the view on the top isn't what you're expecting, right? And you forget that a lot of the little tiny choices, to saying yes to certain things throughout the years, leads to, right, that reality that didn't feel like me at all. It
Yeah.
only felt like what other coaches were doing. It felt like I was on the right route only from measuring myself to the coaches I respected or even mentors that I hired that told me that was the only way to get to the type of coaching practice to be proud of, you know? And so as I had a bit of a sabbatical away from my business, I kind of had to check back in of like, what was I building and why was I building this in the first place for what? I'm in a tropical paradise in Bali and not enjoying any free time. You can certainly take the girl out of the cubicle, and the cubicle mindset can sometimes follow you, right? In
Yeah.
sort of what you think you have to do in order to be successful. So I kind of looked at it was a really interesting thing when I was talking to my therapist about it, of like, I felt, because she's like, what feels not like yourself, in your business? And I was like, it's so funny because in my regular life, I feel like I'm in control. Like I'm a minimalist. I'm a big advocate for simple living. I don't own a lot of stuff. I have very limited handful of friends. I like to deep dive, into those relationships and not see too many people every week, for example. But in my business, I was like this maximalist, like the complete opposite of who
Mm.
I really was. And that's because I always thought business was a whole other beast,
Yeah.
that it had to be a different formula than how I was living my regular life, in order to be successful. So it was sort of almost like going back to my regular life and principles of how I ran my life in real life. And how do I apply those minimalist principles of simplicity, spaciousness, right? Intentionality into my decisions rather than think I have to have 8 products to be seen as a successful coach. So I went from sort of 8 different things, 6 different things every year to one, the next year.
Yeah.
And that was scary because it's like, oh my God, people need all this stuff from me. I can't give it. And that's my job. But it wasn't. It was my responsibilities to do one thing really well. And if I can do one thing and master that, I'm more of service to my clients than trying to solve every damn problem or, in the rainbow for them, right? So it was a lot of shifts in myself to be feeling worthy of doing just one thing,
Yeah.
and knowing that not everyone might like it, and that's okay. But my, right, sustainability, my feeling of ease and peace is important for me to be the best coach I can be for my clients.
I'm loving that. I'm hearing a lot of beautiful threads that people can reflect on is like, how do you ideally want to live your life optimally? And are you in alignment with that in how you run your business and create in the world and offer your services? For me, like I had a huge shift years ago where it felt like I'd always had this inner creative artist, but I felt like my online entrepreneur had to be this buttoned up, wearing a collar, wearing the blazer, like, which is totally not me at all. And I had a huge breakthrough probably about 9 years ago where it was like I finally felt like I could be myself in my business and attract the right people that would be drawn to who I actually am and how I am in the world. And that has just continually evolved. So it sounds like, and maybe you could correct me if I'm wrong, but the work that you do with people is to help them to align their strengths, their interests, and the ways that they want to be of service in the world and figure out, well, how do you turn the cross section of these pieces into a business that you can move forward with? Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's kind of like the core heartbeat, of my work. Like before we do anything else when it comes to the practical business model, marketing plans, strategies, right, which is more of the external, right, way that we're going to run that business. We have to kind of have something that grounds us, right? And that's what I love working with every entrepreneur on, because everyone has sort of a different flavor and recipe and
Yeah.
ingredients about what makes that business feel right for that person. So I always say, in a nutshell, I help people build businesses that feel like home, right?
Yeah.
Home means it feels like it's in your natural tendencies, to offer what you offer in that specific style or way, right? I work with, for example, 70% introverts for some odd reason. They're quite attracted to my business, but introverts market differently. Introverts help clients differently. You and I probably love doing these Zoom calls, for example. Like I could do these all day long, no skin off my back, right? I love that kind of connection. That's a nightmare to some of my clients to be on Zoom calls all day,
Yeah.
so their coaching practice, their, follow-ups, their connection points with how they work with clients or leads, very different, than someone
Yeah.
like me who loves to gab, who loves to connect, that fills me up. Right. So my
Yeah.
business model is built around connections, right? For someone else, it'd be like, yeah, I want to connect, but not like that, right? Like in a different way that may be more asynchronous, and
Yeah.
not live constantly, because that sucks the energy out of me. So that is something that sometimes we don't think about. I certainly didn't. That's why I had that burnout, which is, kind of really thinking, not thinking about like, what's my personality type? What's my day to day? Like, do I want to wake up and work out, for example, when I start my day? Do I want to have afternoons off so that I can enjoy surfing or all the things I moved to Bali for?
Yeah.
Do I want time with my friends? Do I want a long weekend? Do I want to take off, to a sabbatical once a quarter? And not to be found for a week, right? Like, what are
Yeah.
those things that are required outside of the business where my life feels like this is worth it to do this business because there's a reward, in whatever I'm receiving in the experiences of my life in my personal life. So that part, is the first thing I start with, because whether, I work with two groups of people. I work with a lot of kind of mid-career corporate professionals who have done a beautiful work in their body of work, but they no longer want to continue to only earn an income with these sort of structures of, the hierarchy and bureaucracy of a corporation. They're in that age where their kids maybe are they're empty nesters now. They want more freedom to, not have to just constantly be right at a 9 to 5 or 9 to 9 sometimes of a schedule,
Yeah.
right? And then I also work with like, established entrepreneurs that they've built, like what I did, right? Built this Frankenstein of a business. And it's like, holy crap, I built something that I don't want to wake up for every morning,
Yeah.
and I need to fire myself right now to start over and kind of pivot and adapt, right, to a different way of working so that I don't work myself to the ground and just call
Yeah.
myself an entrepreneur, right? So, either way, whichever track of, a starter or a growth person that comes to me, the first thing we kind of make sure that we work on is going to be, what's that lifestyle and business design that needs to be, right? Like really like showcasing, right? The way you want to show up for work every day, the way that you want to engage with your clients and your business so that we are building something that feels like it's, in alignment with the way you want to do your life as well, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I dropped out of college to become an entrepreneur 20 years ago now, because of one word. It was freedom. I saw that
Hmm.
a job was a path, that it was like, I just saw my life unfolding and I was like, this is not leading me in the direction. At the time, playing professional golf was my intention. So I became an entrepreneur to sponsor myself to play the tour. Um, and that just kind of led me into like, oh, entrepreneurship is a way for us to like be the master of our own life and our own purpose. And it's been such a beautiful gift to myself. And I'm sure you feel it as well as coaches that support people to become entrepreneurs and turn their visions into reality and like find that sense of freedom. It's so satisfying when you see people step on the path courageously, because it is a scary thing to do, to like leave the guarantees of, say, a job, a 9 to 5 that gives you a paycheck and you can clock out at the end of the day, to something that you're in charge of. It's your vision. The struggles are your struggles to struggle for. And to see somebody succeed with that, it's such a rewarding thing to do. So
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
for you, just as like I usually keep the interviews short-ish. For like one last question, is there any any question, reflection that you would want to share with people to help them take a look at maybe the cultural or societal program or norms that are potentially driving their operating system for how they're doing business, how they're approaching work, and get them to reimagine and rethink what is actually possible for them if they were to align themselves in a way that was more harmonious with their nature, just like you've done?
Mm. Well, we talked a lot about, the sort of how does a business feel like home, right? Which is what are your strengths, your personalities, what are your values that you want infused into how you run that business, how you show up. But one of the things that I think is an important question to ask as well in conjunction with that is something very real and practical and scary, which is what's enough? What's enough
Yeah.
money? What's enough clients? What's enough time, right?
Yeah.
For us to have, right, in our businesses. And it's funny because it's still a question that changes every year for me. There are times my enough number is low because I want more time and I'm okay, I'm comfortable. And, I live because I travel a lot to not very expensive, countries sometimes. It's like I don't have to earn as much, for example, to have a really
Yeah.
beautiful life. And then there are times like right now I'm building a house, in a plot of land by a river right now, and I, don't get to get a mortgage out, right? So everything's cash and everything is built, with just what I have in my bank account. And so I want to work more this year. My enough number, right, is increasing for a particular dream I want to accomplish this year, right? But
Yeah.
all in all to say is that sometimes we don't actually know what's that enough number because we don't calculate that properly, right? And we think, and I certainly did the same thing, when I was looking at revenue in my business, everything is about like doubling that revenue next year or, making more next year. But sometimes it's not about making more. It's about making enough for what you need and then actually learning how to get to that number in a simpler way, right? Scale your time in a simpler way, do things that are less complicated and complex to get to that revenue, less effort to get to that revenue, right? That's a better goal, in my opinion, sometimes to think about than more money because it's
Yeah.
never really ends, does it? You make more and you want more, because that chasing of that metric is just a number. And that number is, what is that number for, right? And I always think about that every dollar needs to have a purpose. We're not just making money to put money in the bank and for it to look good in our bank account. Like, what is the purpose of this money? And how will you know when you've had enough and how to maintain that enoughness so
Yeah.
that we no longer strive, right, for more for the sake of more. And I think that can be a really kind of like liberating thing to experience, to know what's enough, so that that way you do have boundaries. So when someone says, oh, you should have this, take this opportunity because it's more money, you have a reason to say, no, that's not for me, or it is for me, because there's a grounding, you know, like reason why you're saying yes or no to certain things, right?
Yeah.
So enough is not just about the financial number, even though I think that's important. We live in a monetary society. Money is power, money is freedom, right? For a
Yeah.
lot of us. And that needs to be accounted for. But also, what's enough in terms of what you want to experience in your business? You know, I kind of realized I don't really care that much to be like famous or be on all the top stages and all those
What?
different things. You know, I kind of don't. And I remember one coach telling me, "You're thinking too small." You know, she was like, "You're just like playing small." And I was like, I'm not. I actually really just really love my cozy little life. I don't want to fly to different conferences all the time to do, you know, huge speaking engagements. I will if I'm there and, you know, with the right conference. And I actually quite prefer more boutique kind of like, you know, smaller
Yeah.
crowds, smaller. It's just what I like, you know. Same with concerts. Don't love a big arena. Love an intimate, you know, jam session, right?
Yeah.
Like that's kind of how I want to relate. That's how I want to share my story. And it doesn't always mean that you're playing small, you know. I think there's a feeling when you think where you want that thing, and then you kind of say, "Oh, I don't think I'm good enough for that thing." That's different, right? But for
Yeah.
me, it was like, no, none of that feels good. I love, right? I want to honor what that metric of success looks like for me, and to know when I've experienced it, you know. So
Yeah.
that's not always you know, people will tell you you're playing small when you're not reaching sometimes the standard traditional, right, metrics of what we all celebrate on the Forbes magazines and all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
But it's important to really know deep down your gut telling you what feels good and what doesn't.
What a great reality check for people to check in with themselves and see if they're striving for somebody else's vision. Because, you know, if we get a job, oftentimes we're trying to build somebody else's dream. But even as an entrepreneur, we're trying to build our dream, but we might be doing it through an operating system that is out of alignment with what we actually want and need for ourselves, our life, our family, our intentions, etc. It was beautiful. So, where would you like to invite people to come engage with you? What do you have on offer? Tell us about that. So, I'm sure there's going to be some folks who are inspired by what you've shared and want to come learn more about you.
Absolutely. Thank you. I always say the first place to start to get to know my work is my YouTube channel. It's gonna be like there's like 500 videos in there of all the things I've talked about in the last decade. But specifically, if tiny business or the tiny business revolution has sort of sparked a curiosity inside of you after this conversation, go check out the Tiny Business Revolution playlist, which is kind of like a really curated playlist on how to build a tiny business and sort of a lot of the things we talked about today of aligning decisions and intentional choices and how you want to run a cozy but mighty business, which is a great place to start. My website, obviously, screwthecubicle.com, has a ton of free resources. There's a free quiz on there, which is actually a tiny business quiz I've just created about a year ago, which
But
helps you to see, you know, where, like, what kind of tiny business owner could you be? And what does that look like for your personality type? What does that look like for your value systems? And depending on how you answer those questions, there's a profile of a tiny business kind of leader or business person type, right? That will share with you, you know, the sort of ways to run that kind of tiny business in a way that fulfills you, that is going to also be profitable, and it's also going to be in a style of doing business in a way that is more meaningful for you and doesn't feel like pulling teeth or, you know, putting on a different coat on when it's not yours, right? So that's also a really great resource to start. And so when you get to the quiz, you'll be signed up for my newsletter, which is something that I think people really love reading every week, of some of the insights and my own journey of, you know, figuring out, because it's not always perfect. I also continue sometimes to make decisions that are not in alignment where I thought it is. And I do share that transparently so that you can see that, you know, it's not a perfect journey. We do it imperfectly, you know, in an imperfect action. And there's a lot we can learn from each other about, you know, what's that new horizon of a meaningful business, what's that the lifestyle choices we all crave more of these days, and what does freedom mean to all of us in different ways, right? And so, yeah, I would love for people to join me on that journey if it calls to you.
Amazing. Thank you for taking the time, for waking up nice and early, for letting us watch the sunrise behind you.
Yeah.
It's been a great conversation. All the links are going to be in the show notes for everybody, wherever you're watching or listening to this. And Lydia, I'm going to let you go. Enjoy the beginning of your day. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bradley.
See y'all soon.